Dr. Sarah Blackwood pressed her palm against the ancient stone wall of the ruined temple, feeling the vibrations of centuries past thrumming through her fingertips. The Kolar excavation site in Andhra Pradesh had been her life's work for the past 3 years, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she was close to something extraordinary. The monsoon rains had finally ceased, leaving the air thick with humidity and the scent of wet earth. Her headlamp cut through the darkness of the inner sanctum, illuminating Sanskrit inscriptions that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Her assistant, Raj, had left hours ago, warning her about working alone after sunset. "The locals speak of vengeful spirits, Dr. Blackwood," he had said, his voice trembling. "Some stones are better left undisturbed." But Sarah was a woman of science, not superstition. The carved reliefs on the walls told a story she'd been piecing together for months. The tale of a magnificent temple dedicated to Sita, adorned with the most precious gem the Golconda mines. And at its heart, according to the inscriptions, sat a statue of the goddess herself, her eyes crafted from the rarest blue diamonds ever discovered. Sarah's hands traced the weathered carvings, depicting devotees bringing offerings to Sita's feet. But there were darker images too, scenes of punishment for those who dared defile the sacred space. Bodies twisted in agony, faces frozen in eternal screams, blood pooling beneath the goddess's serene gaze. A cool breeze whispered through the chamber, extinguishing her torch. In the sudden darkness, Sarah fumbled for her flashlight, her heart hammering against her ribs. When the beam flickered to life, she gasped. There, in an alcove she could have sworn was empty moments before, stood a partial statue. The stone figure was headless, its arms reaching forward as if in supplication or warning. But what made Sarah's blood freeze was the indentation in the wall behind it. A perfect outline of a seated figure, with 2 small, circular depressions where eyes should have been. She had found Sita's sanctuary. 3 days later, Sarah's team had carefully excavated the alcove. What they discovered defied explanation. The statue's head lay buried beneath centuries of debris, perfectly preserved despite the temple's decay. Sita's face was carved with exquisite detail, high cheekbones, full lips curved in a mysterious smile, and most remarkably, 2 empty sockets where her eyes should have been. "The craftsmanship is incredible," murmured Dr. James Crawford, the British Museum's leading expert on Indian antiquities, who had flown in to examine the find. 17th century without doubt. But Sarah, these eye sockets, they're too precise, too perfectly shaped. Whatever was embedded here wasn't just decorative, it was integral to the statue's creation. Sarah nodded, running her fingers along the smooth edges of the empty sockets. The inscriptions mentioned Nila Nayana, blue eyes that could see into men's souls and judge their worth. Diamonds, James. Not just any diamonds, but ones that matched the goddess's divine sight. Crawford pulled out his tablet, scrolling through historical records. "You know, there are accounts from Jean-Baptiste Tavernier's travels in the 1660s. He wrote about purchasing a remarkable blue diamond from the Kolar mine, 112 carats of the most perfect blue stone ever seen. He called it the Violet initially. The Hope Diamond," Sarah whispered. "It has to be. The timing, the location, the unusual blue color caused by boron traces. Crawford, we've found where the Hope Diamond originated. This is the eye of Sita herself." That night, alone in her tent, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the statue's empty sockets, imagining them filled with brilliant blue fire. In her dreams, she saw a figure approaching the temple under cover of darkness, a European man with greedy eyes and trembling hands. She watched as he pried the sacred gems from the goddess's face, Sita's stone lips seeming to curse him, even as he stuffed the diamonds into his satchel. Sarah woke screaming, her tent walls seeming to pulse with an otherworldly light. Outside, the dig site was silent, except for the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of wild dogs. But there, in the darkness beyond her tent flap, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing motionless among the ruins. A figure without eyes. The excavation took a darker turn in the following weeks. 3 of Sarah's workers refused to return after claiming they'd seen a woman in white wandering the ruins at night, weeping and searching for something. The remaining crew grew increasingly agitated, jumping at shadows and whispering prayers under their breath. Dr. Crawford had returned to London to research the diamond's history, leaving Sarah alone with her obsession. She'd moved the statue's head to her private tent, unable to tear herself away from its haunting beauty. The empty eye sockets seemed to follow her movements, and she found herself apologizing to the carved face each morning. "I'm sorry," she would whisper. "I know what was taken from you. I know you're incomplete." The first death occurred on a Tuesday. Vikram, one of her most experienced diggers, was found at the bottom of an excavated pit, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. The strange thing was his expression. His face was frozen in a look of absolute terror, his eyes wide and staring at something only he could see. The other workers claimed he'd been alone when they heard him scream, a sound they described as not human. The local police ruled it an accident, but Sarah knew better. She'd heard the scream too, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. It had been a sound of recognition, of seeing something so terrible that the mind simply couldn't process it. The second death came 3 days later. Priya Sharma, the team's photographer and documentation specialist, was found in her tent with her camera still clutched in her hands. The digital display showed her final photograph, a blurry image of what appeared to be a woman in white standing at the foot of her bed. But it was Priya's eyes that truly horrified those who found her. They had turned completely white, as if drained of all color, and tears of blood had dried on her cheeks. "She saw something," whispered Dr. Ananya Patel, the team's cultural liaison, as they waited for the coroner. "In our mythology, when mortals witness divine wrath directly, their sight is burned away. The goddess, she's marking us." The third victim was Marcus Webb, a geology graduate student from Oxford who had joined the expedition to study the temple's construction materials. Unlike the others, Marcus didn't die immediately. Instead, he began speaking in ancient Sanskrit, a language he'd never studied, reciting what sounded like prayers or incantations. For 2 days, he wandered the dig site in a trance, his voice growing hoarser with each passing hour. Dr. Patel translated his words with growing alarm. "The blue fire seeks its home. The severed seeks the whole. Death follows the thief's children until the debt is paid in full." Marcus collapsed on the third day, his vocal cords destroyed from constant recitation. His final words, spoken in his own voice, were, "She's so beautiful and so angry." He died reaching toward the temple ruins, his fingers stained with blue dust that shouldn't have existed anywhere on the site. That night, Sarah sat vigil beside the statue head, studying every detail of its carved features. The remaining team members, Dr. Ananya Patel, Thomas Chen, a digital mapping specialist, Elena Vasquez, an epigrapher, and her assistant Raj, huddled together in the main tent, too terrified to sleep alone. "We should leave," Raj pleaded for the dozenth time. "3 people are dead, Dr. Blackwood. This place is cursed." But Sarah couldn't tear herself away. As the hours passed, she began to notice something disturbing. In certain light, from certain angles, the statue appeared to have different expressions, sometimes serene, sometimes sorrowful, but increasingly often, the stone lips seemed twisted in rage. At 3 a.m., Sarah dozed off in her chair. She dreamed of blue fire dancing in empty sockets, of a voice speaking in ancient Sanskrit, words that seemed to burn themselves into her consciousness. What was taken must be returned. What was severed must be made whole. The thief's line will pay the price. She woke to find her tent in shambles. Her papers were scattered across the floor, her equipment overturned, and carved into the wooden table beside her was a single word in Sanskrit, Shapa, curse. But the statue head remained untouched, sitting serenely on its pedestal, empty sockets seeming to mock her with their void stare. Crawford's emails from London grew increasingly frantic as he delved deeper into the Hope Diamond's history. The stone's path of ownership read like a catalogue of human misery. Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who sold the diamond to King Louis XIV, died penniless and alone in Russia, his body reportedly torn apart by wild dogs. Louis XIV succumbed to gangrene after a reign marked by endless wars and the deaths of his heirs. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette met their fate at the guillotine. The diamond disappeared during the French Revolution, only to resurface in London decades later. Every owner seemed to meet an untimely end. Henry Philip Hope died childless, his family line cursed with madness and suicide. Evelyn Walsh McLean lost her son in a car accident and her daughter to a drug overdose. The pattern was undeniable. The diamond brought death to all who possessed it. But Crawford's most disturbing discovery came from a private collection of manuscripts he'd uncovered in the British Museum's archives. A journal entry from 1667, written by a dying Portuguese trader, described the theft in horrifying detail. The temple was beautiful beyond description, filled with golden light and the scent of jasmine. At its heart sat the goddess, her blue eyes blazing with divine fire. Tavernier was mad with greed, his hands shaking as he approached her throne. When he touched the first diamond, the temperature in the chamber plummeted. The second gem came free with a sound like screaming stone. As we fled, I looked back to see the goddess rising from her throne, her empty sockets weeping tears of blood. She spoke a single word that followed us into the night. Pratikriya, retribution. The trader had died within a week, his journal the only record of what truly happened in that temple. But Crawford discovered more entries detailing the fates of Tavernier's other companions. Antonio the Spaniard succumbed first, found in his chambers with his face aged 50 years overnight, as if his life had been drained away. Then came poor Henry, the French cartographer, who began drawing maps of places that did not exist, speaking of a blue-eyed woman who visited him nightly. The Dutchman, Van der Berg, lasted longest but fared worst. His body was discovered outside Delhi, torn apart by what the locals claimed were her own fingernails, though no human could inflict such wounds. The trader's final entry chilled Crawford to the bone. She follows me still. I see her in reflections, in shadows, in the depths of still water. She searches for what was stolen, and she will not rest until her sight is restored. The blue fire burns eternal, and all who touch it are marked for her vengeance. I have seen what happens to the children of thieves. Generation after generation, they are drawn to her like moths to flame, and she takes her payment in blood and madness. Crawford immediately booked a flight back to India. Sarah's world began to unravel as Crawford's research painted a picture of supernatural vengeance spanning centuries. The haunting had entered a new phase. No longer content with mysterious deaths, Sita's wrath began manifesting more directly. Elena Vasquez, the epigrapher, was the next to die. She had been working late in her tent, translating the Sanskrit inscriptions from the temple walls, when the others heard her screaming. They found her hunched over her desk, frantically carving symbols into her own arms with a shard of pottery. The inscriptions she'd been translating had changed before their eyes, now reading, "The thief's blood calls to me. I will have satisfaction." Elena's eyes had turned the same shocking blue as the stolen diamonds, and she spoke in Sita's voice. "Each death weakens the veil between worlds. Each spilled drop of blood feeds my hunger for justice." She collapsed moments later, her body contorted in impossible angles, her final breath escaping in a whisper. "She's coming through." Thomas Chen, the digital mapping specialist, lasted 3 more days. His high-tech equipment began malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. His ground-penetrating radar showed moving figures beneath the earth. His thermal cameras detected a woman-shaped heat signature that flickered in and out of existence. On the second night, his cameras captured something that made the remaining team members vomit when they saw the footage. A pale figure emerging from the statue alcove, her empty eye sockets weeping blood as she searched the camp. Thomas tried to flee on the 3rd day, but his jeep broke down just 50 meters from the dig site. Dr. Patel and Raj found him the next morning, still sitting in the driver's seat. His body was unmarked, but his face was locked in an expression of such pure terror that both men required sedation afterward. The strangest detail was his smartphone. The screen displayed a selfie he'd somehow taken moments before his death, showing himself screaming while a beautiful woman with one blazing blue eye embraced him from behind. Dr. Ananya Patel, despite her growing terror, tried to maintain scientific objectivity. She documented each death meticulously, noting the supernatural elements while searching for rational explanations. Her cultural knowledge made her the most dangerous to Sita's plans. She understood the true nature of what they were dealing with, and kept trying to convince Sarah to perform purification rituals that might break the curse. "In our traditions," she explained desperately to Sarah as they sat surrounded by the bodies of their colleagues, "when a sacred object is stolen, the divine essence becomes corrupted. The goddess is no longer protecting, she's hunting. We need to appease her, not antagonize her further." But Sarah was beyond reasoning. Each death had drawn her deeper into Sita's influence, and she found herself feeling grateful for the sacrifice of her team members. Their deaths were clearing the way for her true purpose, reuniting the goddess with her stolen eye. Raj, her faithful assistant, was the next to die and the most heartbreaking. He had stayed out of loyalty to Sarah, despite his terror, believing he could somehow save her from the supernatural forces consuming the dig site. On his final night, he sat vigil with Sarah beside the statue head, both of them watching for signs of the goddess's manifestation. "Dr. Blackwood," he whispered, "I can see her now. She's standing right behind you." Sarah turned but saw nothing. When she looked back, Raj was smiling peacefully, his eyes reflecting blue fire that wasn't coming from any earthly source. He reached out to touch the statue head, and the moment his fingers made contact with the carved stone, his life force was drained instantly. His body crumbled to dust, leaving only his clothes and a small pile of ash that scattered in a breeze that touched nothing else in the tent. Dr. Patel was found the next morning in her tent, having apparently died of fright during the night. Her journal contained a final entry written in shaking handwriting. "She has taken them all. Sarah is no longer Sarah. She is becoming something else, something that serves the goddess's will. I can hear them whispering together in languages that predate human speech. God forgive us, we should never have disturbed this place." Sarah now stood alone among the ruins, surrounded by the bodies and ashes of her team, but she felt no grief, only purpose. Only the growing certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The goddess had cleared away all obstacles to their reunion, and soon, very soon, the stolen eye would return home. The hauntings intensified nightly. Sarah would wake to find her tent rearranged, her belongings moved in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. Cold spots appeared throughout the dig site, areas where the temperature dropped so suddenly that her breath would fog in the tropical heat. And always there were the sounds, soft footsteps in the sand, the whisper of silk against stone, and most terrifying of all, quiet weeping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But it was the dreams that truly terrorized her. Each night, Sarah found herself standing in the temple as it had been centuries ago, watching helplessly as Tavernier and his companions desecrated the sacred space. She felt Sita's rage like a physical force, saw the goddess's spiritual form rise from the statue as her physical eyes were stolen. In these visions, Sarah was both observer and participant, somehow complicit in the ancient crime. On the 7th night after Crawford's departure, Sarah's dreams took a different turn. Instead of witnessing the theft, she found herself face to face with Sita herself. The goddess stood in her temple, beautiful and terrible, her empty sockets seeming to stare directly into Sarah's soul. "You know where they are," Sita spoke, her voice like temple bells and grinding stone. "You know what must be done. The circles must be completed, the theft must be undone." "I don't have them," Sarah pleaded. "The diamonds are thousands of miles away in a museum. I can't." "Cannot?" Sita's voice rose to a shriek that shattered the Dream Temple's pillars. "Or will not. The thief's blood calls to the stolen eyes. The debt passes from generation to generation until it is paid." Sarah woke to find her tent on fire. The journey to Golconda, 1660. Jean-Baptiste Tavernier wiped the sweat from his brow as his caravan approached the legendary diamond mines of Golconda. The French gem merchant had traveled thousands of miles across treacherous terrain, driven by tales of stones so magnificent they were said to hold the light of stars themselves. At 55, this would be his greatest expedition and his last. The Kohler mine stretched before him like a wound in the earth, hundreds of workers sifting through gravel under the scorching Indian sun. But Tavernier wasn't interested in the common stones being pulled from the river deposits. Local whispers spoke of something far more precious hidden in the ancient temple overlooking the mines. A treasure that belonged to the gods themselves, the sacred discovery. The Temple of Sita, stood magnificent against the twilight sky, its carved spires reaching toward heaven like stone prayers. Tavernier had bribed the local guides handsomely to bring him here after dark, when the priests would be absent and the sacred chambers unguarded. "Sahib, this is madness," whispered his Portuguese companion, Manuel da Costa. "The locals say this place is protected by divine power. We should not." "Superstition," Tavernier scoffed, though his voice trembled slightly. "These are just stones, valuable stones that belong in the courts of Europe, not rotting in some jungle shrine." The inner sanctum took his breath away. Golden oil lamps cast dancing shadows across walls covered in intricate carvings depicting the goddess Sita in all her glory. And there, at the chamber's heart, sat the statue that would haunt Tavernier's remaining days. She was carved from the finest white marble, every detail perfect, from her serene smile to the delicate folds of her sari. But it was her eyes that stopped Tavernier's heart. Two magnificent blue diamonds, each the size of a plum, blazing with inner fire that seemed almost alive in the lamplight. Tavernier's hands shook as he approached the statue. The diamonds were embedded deep in the marble sockets, held in place by some ancient technique that made them appear to be natural parts of the goddess's face. As he drew closer, the temperature in the chamber plummeted, and his breath began to fog despite the tropical heat. "The eyes of Sita see into the souls of men," Manuel whispered, backing toward the entrance. "They judge the worthy from the unworthy. Sahib, we must leave this place." But greed had consumed Tavernier's reason. He pulled out his tools, a small hammer and chisel designed for prying gems from their settings. The first strike against the marble rang out like a scream through the chamber. With each blow, the sound grew more human, more anguished, until Tavernier was certain he heard the goddess herself crying out in pain. The left eye came free with a sound like breaking glass mixed with human sobbing. The diamond was even more magnificent up close, 112 carats of the purest blue fire, its surface reflecting not just light, but something deeper, something that seemed to move with a life of its own. As Tavernier reached for the second eye, the world exploded into chaos, the wrath of the divine. The temperature in the chamber dropped so suddenly that ice crystals formed on the walls. The oil lamps flickered and died, plunging the shrine into darkness, broken only by the eerie blue glow emanating from the stolen diamond in Tavernier's hands. In that otherworldly light, the merchant saw something that would shatter his sanity forever. The statue of Sita was moving. Her stone lips parted in a scream of rage that seemed to come from the earth itself. Her remaining eye blazed with fury, while the empty socket wept tears of blood that ran down her marble cheeks like crimson rain. Her arms, which had been folded in peaceful prayer, now reached toward Tavernier, with grasping fingers that stretched like shadows across the chamber floor. "Pratikriya," the goddess spoke, her voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "Retribution," Tavernier ran. He crashed through the temple corridors, the stolen diamond burning like ice in his clenched fist. Behind him, he could hear the sound of stone grinding against stone as something massive gave pursuit. Manuel was screaming somewhere in the darkness, his voice cutting off abruptly in a way that made Tavernier's blood freeze. The merchant burst from the temple into the night, not stopping until he reached his caravan. His guides took one look at his terror-stricken face and began breaking camp immediately. By dawn, they were miles away, but Tavernier knew with sick certainty that distance meant nothing to what he had awakened. The voyage back to Europe became a nightmare that lasted months. Tavernier's ships were plagued by impossible storms that seemed to follow them across the Indian Ocean. Crew members reported seeing a figure in white standing on the waves, her empty eye socket weeping blood into the churning sea. The diamond itself seemed alive with malevolent energy. It would grow burning hot without warning, searing Tavernier's flesh through the protective wrapping. Other times, it became so cold that touching it caused frostbite. And always, he could hear whispers emanating from its faceted surface. Sanskrit words he didn't understand, but that filled him with existential dread. Tavernier began seeing her everywhere. In reflections in still water, she stood behind him, one eye blazing with divine fury, the other a weeping void. In shadows cast by candlelight, her reaching hands stretched toward him across walls and floors. In his dreams, she sat upon her temple throne, speaking that single word over and over. Pratikriya, Pratikriya, Pratikriya. Sleep became impossible. Food turned to ash in his mouth. His hair turned completely white within weeks, and his hands developed a permanent tremor that made writing nearly impossible. The other merchants in his caravan began to shun him, claiming his presence brought bad luck and unnatural cold. When Tavernier finally reached the court of Louis XIV in 1668, he was a broken man masquerading as a successful merchant. The Sun King was enchanted by the magnificent blue diamond, agreeing to purchase it for a sum that would make Tavernier one of the wealthiest men in France. For a brief moment, as the diamond left his hands forever, Tavernier felt relief. The constant whispers stopped. The supernatural cold that had followed him across continents began to fade. He dared to hope that selling the cursed stone had freed him from its influence. He was wrong. The curse didn't end with the sale, it simply changed form. Rather than tormenting him directly, Sita's vengeance began to work through the world around him. His investments failed mysteriously. His ships sank in calm seas. His family began dying in bizarre accidents that defied explanation. By 1689, Tavernier had lost everything. His fortune was gone, his family dead or estranged, his reputation in ruins. At 84, he made one final journey, to Russia, driven by some compulsion he couldn't name or resist. He told friends he was going to recover debts owed to him by Russian nobles. But those who saw him before his departure reported that he seemed to be fleeing something rather than chasing profit. His eyes held a haunted quality, and he would sometimes stop mid-conversation to stare at empty spaces, as if seeing something invisible to others. The end came quickly. Tavernier's frozen body was found in a forest outside Moscow, torn apart by what authorities claimed were wild dogs. But there were aspects of the scene that troubled the investigators. The perfect circle of dead vegetation around the corpse, the way the snow had melted in strange patterns, and most disturbing of all, the expression of absolute terror frozen on the old merchant's face. Local peasants whispered that they had seen a woman in white leading a pack of spectral hounds through the forest that night, her single eye blazing blue in the darkness, while blood wept from an empty socket. The blaze consumed most of Sarah's equipment, but somehow the statue head remained untouched by the flames. As she sat in the ruins of her temporary home, watching the last embers die in the pre-dawn darkness, Crawford's jeep roared into camp. He took one look at the devastation and grabbed Sarah by the shoulders. "We need to leave. Now. I've found something in London that changes everything." "I can't leave her," Sarah whispered, cradling the statue head. "She's suffering, James. I can feel her pain. She's been incomplete for over 3 centuries. Crawford pulled out a thick folder of documents, his hands shaking as he showed her crime scene photos from the camp. "Sarah, listen to me. 7 people are dead. 7 people who trusted you, who followed you into this nightmare. And I've traced Tavernier's genealogy. The curse isn't random, it follows bloodlines, and there's something about your family history you need to know." Sarah barely glanced at the photographs of her dead colleagues. Elena's carved arms, Thomas's terrified face, the pile of ash that had once been Raj, none of it seemed to touch her emotionally. She was beyond such human concerns now. "They served their purpose," she said calmly, causing Crawford to recoil in horror. "Their deaths fed her power, brought her closer to manifestation. Don't you see, James? It was all necessary." Sarah's blood turned to ice as Crawford laid out the evidence. Her great-great-great-grandmother had been Marie Blackwood, née Tavernier, Jean-Baptiste's youngest daughter, who had emigrated to America in the early 18th century to escape the scandal surrounding her father's death. The family had changed their name, buried their history, but the connection remained. "You're his descendant, Sarah. The curse has been drawing you here your entire career. Think about it. Your obsession with Indian archaeology, your specialty in Golconda diamonds, your uncanny ability to locate this specific temple. It's not coincidence. It's retribution, calling you home." As the truth sank in, Sarah felt a cold presence settle around her like a shroud. The air grew thick with the scent of jasmine and decay, and she could swear she heard soft laughter echoing from the ruins. She's been waiting for me, Sarah realized. All these centuries, she's been waiting for Tavernier's line to return to her. But why? What does she want? Crawford's face was grave. According to the manuscripts, the curse can only be broken one way. The stolen eyes must be returned to their proper place by a blood descendant of the thief. But Sarah, the ritual requires a life. The descendant must take Tavernier's place in paying the price for his sacrilege. The statue head in Sarah's arms seemed to grow heavier, its empty sockets boring into her soul with ancient hunger. Despite Crawford's protests, Sarah refused to abandon the dig site. She was Tavernier's descendant, and she would face whatever fate awaited her. But first, she needed to retrieve the diamond, Sita's stolen eye, from its current location. The Smithsonian will never release the Hope Diamond, Crawford argued as they sat among the ruins. It's their most prized possession, worth over $350 million. Even if we could prove our case, the legal battles would take years. Sarah smiled grimly, her fingers tracing the statue's carved cheekbones. Who said anything about asking permission? The plan she outlined was audacious and probably suicidal. Using her credentials and Crawford's connections, they would gain access to the Smithsonian's gem hall during a private research session. The Hope Diamond was occasionally removed from its display case for scientific study. They would strike during one of these windows. But as they prepared for the journey to Washington, D.C., the supernatural attacks intensified. Sarah woke one morning to find her hands covered in cuts that spelled out Sanskrit words, Jaldi Aao. The statue head had moved during the night, now facing directly toward the west, toward America, toward its missing eye. The flight to Washington was a nightmare that extended beyond the aircraft itself. Sarah's supernatural influence had grown stronger after absorbing the life forces of her team, and the plane became a flying tomb of terror. 3 passengers died during the flight under mysterious circumstances. An elderly businessman in first class was found in the lavatory with his face aged beyond recognition, as if decades of life had been drained from him in minutes. A young mother traveling with her infant began speaking in Sanskrit, reciting death prayers while her baby screamed inconsolably. She was found dead in her seat during meal service, her eyes turned pure white, while her child remained physically unharmed but had stopped crying entirely, as if something essential had been drained from the baby's spirit. Most disturbing was the fate of Captain James Morrison, the pilot. During the final approach to Washington, he began seeing things in the cockpit. A woman in white, standing in the aisle behind him, her empty eye sockets weeping blood onto the instrument panel. His co-pilot later testified that Morrison kept turning around to speak to someone who wasn't there, saying things like, "Yes, my lady, and I understand, goddess." The plane landed safely, but Captain Morrison was found dead at the controls moments after touchdown, his hands fused to the yoke as if by extreme heat. The autopsy would reveal that his heart had crystallized in his chest, turned to a substance resembling blue diamond. Attendant Maria Santos, who had tried to help the affected passengers, survived but was never the same. She reported seeing Sarah's reflection in the airplane windows change throughout the flight, sometimes appearing as herself, sometimes as a beautiful Indian woman with one blazing blue eye. She wasn't human anymore, Maria told investigators. She was becoming something else, something that made death follow her like a faithful dog. The supernatural events were covered up by the airline and federal authorities, the deaths attributed to a rare contamination of the cabin air supply. But those who survived the flight would never forget the feeling of being trapped in the sky with something that was no longer entirely mortal, something that left a trail of corpses in its wake as it pursued its dark destiny. Crawford noticed Sarah's condition deteriorating throughout the journey. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and she spoke in whispers, as if afraid of being overheard. She clutched a small bag containing fragments of the statue's original temple stone, claiming they helped her stay connected to Sita's presence. "This is madness, Sarah," he pleaded as their taxi pulled up to their Washington hotel. "Even if we succeed in stealing the diamond, then what? You'll be a fugitive, and the curse will be broken," Sarah interrupted, her voice hollow. "One way or another, it will be broken." The Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History closed to the public at 5:30 p.m., but Crawford's research appointment was scheduled for 7 p.m., a private session to examine the Hope Diamond's fluorescent properties under ultraviolet light. The security staff on duty knew him by reputation, trusting the distinguished British academic with minimal supervision. Sarah had hidden in the museum's storage areas since morning, using her archaeological expertise to navigate the labyrinthine basement tunnels. As evening fell, she made her way to the gem hall, every shadow seeming to writhe with supernatural anticipation. The Janet Annenberg Hooker Hall of Geology, Gems and Minerals was eerily quiet after hours. The Hope Diamond sat in its rotating display case, 45.52 carats of blue fire, catching the security lighting like captured starlight. Even through the bulletproof glass, Sarah could feel its power, a malevolent energy that seemed to recognize her presence. Crawford arrived precisely at 7, accompanied by Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the museum's curator of gems and minerals, and 2 security guards. Protocols had been tightened following recent threats against high-value artifacts. As they went through the security protocols to remove the diamond from its case, Sarah held her breath in her hiding spot behind a display of meteorites. The boron impurities create this incredible phosphor. Fascinating how the blue color intensifies under UV light, Dr. Martinez commented as she carefully lifted the diamond with specialized tweezers. A scent effect. Sarah watched, transfixed, as the diamond began to glow with an otherworldly blue radiance under the ultraviolet lamp. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw an eye staring back at her from within the stone's depths. Sita's eye, trapped and burning with centuries of rage. The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in seconds later, bathing the hall in red emergency lighting. But in that brief moment of darkness, Sarah had moved with inhuman speed. The supernatural energies she'd absorbed from her dead team members now flowed through her like liquid lightning. Dr. Martinez collapsed as Sarah's bare hand touched her throat, not from chloroform, but from something far worse. The curator's life force drained away in seconds, her body aging decades in moments until only a withered husk remained. The 2 security guards raised their weapons, but Sarah was no longer bound by human limitations. She moved like smoke between them, her touch turning their firearms to rusted metal. Guard Thompson managed one terrified scream before Sarah's fingers found his neck, draining his youth and vitality to fuel her supernatural transformation. Guard Williams tried to run, but the museum itself seemed to conspire against him. Doors slammed shut, corridors rearranged themselves, and finally the building's very architecture crushed him beneath a fallen display case that shouldn't have been able to move. Crawford, caught off guard, stumbled backward as Sarah snatched the diamond from the examination table. Where her skin touched the stone, both began to glow with the same blue fire. "Sarah, don't!" Crawford shouted, but she was already running. The Hope Diamond clutched in her fist like a fragment of captured sky, leaving behind 3 fresh corpses and the smell of jasmine mixed with death. Security alarms shrieked throughout the museum as Sarah sprinted through corridors she'd memorized during her day-long reconnaissance. Behind her, she could hear Crawford shouting explanations to the guards, buying her precious seconds. The diamond in her hand pulsed with unnatural warmth, and she swore she could hear whispers in ancient Sanskrit emanating from its faceted surface. She burst through an emergency exit into the Washington night, the stolen eye of a goddess burning like ice in her palm. The flight back to India was a hellscape of supernatural torment. With the Hope Diamond in her possession, Sarah became a conduit for centuries of accumulated curse energy. Passengers around her complained of nightmares, nausea, and an overwhelming sense of dread. The plane's instruments malfunctioned repeatedly, and the pilot later reported seeing impossible weather patterns that seemed to follow their aircraft across continents. Sarah herself was beyond rational thought. The diamond's proximity had opened a direct connection between her consciousness and Sita's vengeful spirit. She spent the 20-hour journey in a fevered delirium, speaking in tongues and scratching Sanskrit symbols into her arms with her fingernails. The few passengers brave enough to approach her reported that her eyes had taken on a distinctly blue tint, and her skin was cold to touch despite the cabin's warm temperature. Crawford had managed to avoid arrest by claiming Sarah had suffered a complete psychological breakdown and stolen the diamond in a fit of academic obsession. The international manhunt that followed would eventually lead to Interpol alerts across a dozen countries. But for now, Sarah had a head start. She landed in Hyderabad like an avenging spirit, her appearance so drastically changed that airport security barely recognized her passport photo. Her once professional demeanor had been replaced by an otherworldly intensity that made people instinctively step away from her path. The taxi driver who agreed to take her to the Kolar dig site later claimed he'd never been so frightened in his life. She kept talking to something in the back seat. He told police afterward, but there was nothing there, just empty air. And the temperature in the car, it was like driving through a freezer, even with the heat on full blast. The dig site had been abandoned since Sarah's departure, the local authorities having cordoned off the area following reports of supernatural disturbances. But fences and warning signs meant nothing to someone driven by divine compulsion. Sarah cut through the barriers with bolt cutters, making her way to the temple ruins under the light of a blood-red moon. In her bag, alongside the stolen Hope Diamond, she carried the statue head of Sita. The carved stone face had continued changing during their journey, its expression now one of terrible anticipation. The empty eye sockets seemed to dilate in the moonlight, eager for their missing piece to return home. The temple ruins had transformed in Sarah's absence. What had once been scattered stones and weathered foundations now seemed to pulse with dark energy. Vegetation had withered in perfect circles around the dig site, and the very air hummed with supernatural tension. As Sarah approached the inner sanctum where she'd discovered Sita's statue, she realized she was no longer in control of her own actions. The goddess's will flowed through her like a river of molten silver, guiding her movements with inexorable purpose. Sarah's hands moved without conscious direction, carefully placing the statue head in its original position within the alcove. The stone face settled into place with a sound like a sigh of relief, and immediately the temperature around the ruins dropped by 20 degrees. "Now," whispered a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere, speaking directly into Sarah's mind. "Complete what was begun, restore what was stolen, pay the price that has been owed for 3 centuries. Sarah held the Hope Diamond up to the moonlight, watching how its blue fire seemed to respond to the spectral presence filling the temple. The stone was no longer just a gem, it was a piece of divinity, torn from its rightful place and corrupted by human greed. As she approached the statue, the diamond began to resonate with a low harmonic frequency that made her bones ache. The left eye socket was perfectly shaped to hold the diamond, as if it had been carved specifically for this stone. As Sarah pressed the Hope Diamond into place, the fit was so exact that the gem seemed to meld with the surrounding stone. The moment it settled into position, the entire temple complex exploded with blue light. Sarah screamed as Sita's consciousness flooded her mind completely. She experienced every moment of the goddess's 3-century torment, the agony of incompleteness, the burning rage at the violation of her sacred form, the endless hunt for the thieves who had defiled her temple. But beneath the pain and fury, Sarah felt something else, a deep, abiding love for all living things that had been twisted into vengeance by centuries of injustice. "I understand," Sarah gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I understand why you couldn't rest, but I can only give you one eye. The other diamond is lost, cut into smaller stones centuries ago." Sita's presence in her mind softened slightly. One eye is enough to see clearly, but the debt remains. The thief's descendant must pay the price for her ancestor's crime. Sarah nodded, knowing this moment had been inevitable since the day she'd first set foot in the temple. "What do you need me to do?" The ritual that followed was unlike anything from conventional archaeology or religious practice. It was something older, darker, a form of divine justice that predated written history. As the Hope Diamond settled into its rightful place, the statue of Sita began to change. Color flowed into the carved stone like water filling a vessel. The gray limestone took on the warm golden hue of human skin, and the rigid features softened into lifelike beauty. When the transformation reached the diamond eye, it blazed with such intensity that Sarah had to shield her face with her hands. I see, Sita spoke, her voice now coming from the statue's moving lips rather than inside Sarah's head. I see the truth of your heart, daughter of the thief. You carry his blood, but not his greed. You came here not for gold or glory, but to right an ancient wrong. Sarah fell to her knees before the animated statue, overwhelmed by the goddess's presence. I'm sorry for what he did. I'm sorry for the centuries of pain you've endured. Tell me how to make it right. Sita's expression was infinitely sad as she regarded her ancestor's descendant. The curse was not meant for you, child. It was meant for him, for Tavernier and his greed. But curses are crude things, unable to distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. They follow bloodlines like poison in a well, contaminating generations. The goddess reached out with a hand that was now flesh rather than stone, touching Sarah's cheek with surprising gentleness. To break the curse, the debt must be paid. But not with your life, brave one, with your choice. I don't understand, Sarah whispered. You can leave this place, Sita explained. Take your knowledge and your discoveries to the world. Become famous for finding my temple, write your papers, claim your accolades. Live a full life, but always knowing that your happiness is built on my continued torment. The curse will follow your children and their children, growing stronger with each generation. Sarah's heart clenched. Or you can choose to stay. Become my guardian, my protector, ensuring that what was stolen is never taken again. Your life will be bound to this place, but the curse will end with you. Your bloodline will be free, and I will finally have peace. The choice was no choice at all. Sarah had spent her career studying ancient civilizations, understanding the weight of history, and the debts that the past owed to the present. She thought of her sister's children back in America, of the generations yet to come who could live free of Tavernier's ancient crime. I'll stay, she said without hesitation. Sita smiled, and in that expression, Sarah saw the face of every mother who had ever made a sacrifice for her children's future. Then let it be done. What followed was not death in any conventional sense, but rather a metamorphosis that transcended the boundaries between mortal and divine. As Sita spoke words in Sanskrit that had not been uttered for millennia, Sarah felt her physical form beginning to change. Her skin took on a luminous quality, becoming translucent like alabaster held up to candlelight. Her hair darkened to midnight black and began to move as if stirred by unfelt breezes. Most remarkably, her eyes began to shift color, one remaining her natural brown while the other slowly transformed to match the brilliant blue of the Hope Diamond. You will be my guardian, Sita explained as the transformation continued. Part human, part spirit, bound to this sacred place, but granted the power to protect it from those who would defile it again. You will age slowly, living for centuries rather than decades, watching over what remains of my temple. Sarah felt the change on a cellular level, her mortality not ending but extending, stretching like taffy until her lifetime could be measured in centuries rather than years. She retained her human consciousness, her memories, her personality, but overlaid upon them was something ancient and powerful. What about Crawford? She asked, thinking of her colleague who had risked everything to help her. He'll be blamed for the theft. His career will be ruined. Sita's expression darkened slightly. He chose his path when he aided in returning what was stolen. His sacrifice will not go unrewarded. In time, he will understand that some things are more important than human law. As dawn broke over the Kohler ruins, Sarah Blackwood as she had been ceased to exist. In her place stood something new, a guardian spirit bound to the temple, forever watching over Sita's restored sanctuary. Her transformation was complete, but unlike the victims of the curse throughout history, she felt no rage or despair. Instead, she experienced a deep sense of purpose, of finally being exactly where she belonged. The Hope Diamond blazed in the morning light, no longer a stolen treasure, but a divine eye restored to its rightful place. And in the temple ruins of ancient Kohler, two guardians, one goddess, one willing sacrifice, began their eternal vigil. 3 months later, Dr. James Crawford stood at the edge of the cordoned-off dig site, officially banned from the area by both Indian authorities and international warrant. The Hope Diamond's theft had indeed ruined his career, just as Sarah had feared. But he found he cared less about professional reputation than he'd expected. The official story was that Dr. Sarah Blackwood had suffered a complete psychological breakdown, stolen one of the world's most valuable diamonds, and disappeared into the Indian wilderness. Search teams had found no trace of her, despite weeks of intensive hunting. The prevailing theory was that she had fallen victim to wild animals or died of exposure in the remote jungle. But Crawford knew better. On clear nights, when the moon was full, he could see lights moving through the ruins. Not electric lights, but something older and more mysterious. Local villagers spoke in whispers of a blue-eyed woman who appeared in the temple at sunset, beautiful and terrible, guarding something precious from those who would steal it. The curse of the Hope Diamond was officially broken, though not in the way anyone expected. The Smithsonian never recovered their stolen treasure. Sarah had successfully transported it to India and used it to restore Sita's eye. However, within 48 hours of the theft, museum staff discovered an identical diamond in the display case, as if it had never been stolen at all. Security footage from those crucial hours showed only empty corridors, then suddenly the diamond appearing as if materialized from thin air. What the cameras couldn't capture was the supernatural transaction that had occurred. In the moment Sarah pressed the real Hope Diamond into Sita's eye socket, the goddess's power had reached across continents to create a perfect duplicate in the museum, ensuring that the theft would never be discovered by mortal authorities. The replacement diamond was indistinguishable from the original in every measurable way. Same weight, same dimensions, same optical properties, but it was fundamentally different. While the real Hope Diamond now blazed with divine fire in an ancient temple, its replica served as a supernatural anchor, maintaining the illusion that nothing had ever been disturbed. Crawford never found another position in academic archaeology, but he didn't mind. He'd seen something in that temple that transcended professional achievement, a glimpse of justice that operated on timescales far beyond human comprehension. Sometimes, late at night in his small apartment in London, he would dream of Sarah standing eternal watch in an ancient temple, her mismatched eyes, one brown, one blazing blue, keeping vigil over mysteries that predated human civilization. And in those dreams, she didn't look cursed, she looked free. What remains on display in the Smithsonian Institution is a perfect replica, created through supernatural means, when Sita's power briefly merged with the physical world. The real Hope Diamond rests forever in the eye socket of a goddess statue in a sealed temple in India, blazing with blue fire that no human eyes will ever see again. The Kolar Dig site was permanently sealed by the Indian government in 2025, officially due to geological instability. Though local reports of supernatural activity continue to circulate among those brave enough to approach the ruins after dark. The replica is so perfect that even the world's leading gemologists cannot detect the difference. But occasionally, visitors to the museum report strange experiences, feeling watched by the diamond, seeing blue flames flicker in its depths, or hearing whispers in ancient Sanskrit when they stand too close to the display case. These reports are always dismissed as imagination, but the diamond's supernatural origin ensures that even its copy carries an echo of the original curse. Some say that on certain nights, when the monsoon winds carry the scent of jasmine across the plains of Andhra Pradesh, you can still hear two voices singing ancient Sanskrit hymns. One the voice of a goddess restored to wholeness, the other the voice of a mortal woman who chose eternity over escape, ensuring that some sacred things remain sacred forever. The curse of Sita is broken, but Sita is yet to be whole.